Good. All right. Excellent. So this is the second public meeting for our Downtown Mystic Resiliency and Sustainability Plan project. And wanted to first start by just saying thank you. Thank you all for showing up and answering questions, giving us feedback, learning about what we're learning about with this. We really appreciate your input and your interest, and you all finding the time to dedicate to spending with us this early evening. So welcome. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving a little bit of context where we are in the project. And then Sam is going to talk about some of the draft vulnerability assessment results. So pretty brief, about 20 minutes, and then we can get back to the tables. But wanted to do this just to give a little bit of context for those who didn't attend the first public meeting and are new to the project, and also for those who did attend and want to know what we've done since then. So we are very, very thankful. We received funding through the Long Island Sound Futures Fund grant program for this project, and without it, we wouldn't be here today. So much appreciation to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for their support. As you can tell from the title of the project, the entire intent here is to build a resiliency and sustainability plan for downtown Mystic. And what does that mean? Really, so for downtown Mystic, our study area is shown in red. It's kind of hard to see up here, but it's on most of the GZA figures as well. And with resiliency, we're talking about the ability to withstand risks and negative impacts. And for this project, we're specifically talking about climate change, right? So the climate change impacts that this area is experiencing and will continue to experience moving forward. And then with sustainability, it's all about making decisions today that are going to help create a healthy world, a more positive future for upcoming generations. So more specifically, when we talk about being resilient to climate hazards, for the purpose of this project, we are largely focusing on flooding and heat. And with flooding, there's coastal flooding, so sea level rise and storm surge, king tides, nuisance floodings, all of those sorts of things. But then it's also extreme precipitation and how these large flashy storm events overwhelm our stormwater systems. We have flooding from waterlogged streams, overfilling their banks. And then with heat, if you're part of the first public meeting, or if you've taken a look at the figures over there, it's pretty incredible, the projections for how heat are going to increase for this area, how our climate is changing in that way. And so that's something that we haven't talked a lot about in previous town projects. And so we thought it was really important to make part of this effort. So I am Megan. I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Megan Granado. I work for the Town of Groton. I'm the Town Sustainability and Resilience Manager. And we have a great planning team in our office working on this project. Our consultant is GZA, and like I said, you'll hear from Sam. They produce all the figures today. They are really helping drive this project forward through their expertise. And then we also have a steering committee helping provide input on major decision points with representatives from different town departments, other town groups, also the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, CIRCA, and local businesses. So it's not just me making these decisions. We have a number of folks involved in helping steer the project and making sure it's progressing the best way it can. The project essentially contains two big components. The first is understanding our vulnerability to these climate hazards. So that involves a lot of analysis of geospatial layers. It also involved us doing a lot of conversations and field assessments. So I'll talk about those in a minute. And throughout this process, we're looking for a lot of community input. So through events like tonight, we're getting to hear from you what you are experiencing and what you think we should do about it, which is so important for the entire process. And then after the vulnerability assessment, we're going to be switching into identifying what we should do about it. So what are the resilience actions we should be prioritizing to help us deal with these hazards? And those are going to be made at a couple of different scales. So there will be best practices for homeowners. There will also be things that the town should be doing, and even regionally, what we should think about along the Mystic River corridor. And we're right kind of at this pivot point. So as you'll hear from Sam, they have the draft vulnerability assessment wrapped up, and we're starting, as you saw through the survey questions, if you've taken that, to bridge into, okay, what are some of these general ideas that we should start thinking about of ways we can address these hazards? So where we are in the project timeline is towards kind of getting to the end of the amount of time we have in terms of, we got the grant funding back in January of 2022, but there was a lot of work that had to be done to set up the entire approach, do a quality assurance project plan, all that good stuff. So we've really hit the ground running with the start of the new year. We did field surveys. GZA has been working on all the GIS analysis. We have this public meeting. We've already received a couple of chapters of the report. So the report is already being written in terms of some of the preliminary information describing the study area. We'll have a third public meeting likely this fall, and the entire effort is going to wrap up by November. So for field surveys, we spent 3 days out knocking on doors within the special flood hazard area. So that's a subset of the project area that's really vulnerable to flooding. And there was about 110 structures in the special flood hazard area. And we went door by door, knocking on every single one, asking to talk to people about their experiences where they live, or business owners about the properties that they're in. And I have to say the response was tremendous. People were so inviting. People were so willing to spend their time with us, talking to us about this issue, sharing their experiences, and we were just so appreciative of that. In terms of, full surveys, we had about 70% of the properties covered. Some of the properties, if people weren't home, we could take some notes from the sidewalk, but we had pretty good response of actually being able to talk to people and fill out the full survey sheets. And we learned some interesting things that are all getting added into this vulnerability assessment. So the fact that 60% of the building surveyed has basements, for example, is really critical to our understanding of flood vulnerability in this area. If you have below grade space, especially if it's finished, these are areas that tend to be more prone to flooding. And so we asked people a lot of questions about, okay, if you have basements, is that where your utilities are? And if they are they elevated, right? So understanding more about the individual properties in the survey area and how they are vulnerable to flooding. And something really fascinating that we learned, and why I think it's so important to go out and do the field surveys and talk with people about this, is that there's an entirely sort of different dynamic to some of the flooding than we had previously realized. So we learned in talking to people along Pearl Street that Pearl Street used to be an inlet. It was open water. So we heard this from a number of folks, and I went back and reached out to the Mystic River Historical Society and Michael Spellman with Groton Public Library, and they helped me find historical maps of the area that were really fascinating, and that they show how humans shaped the land over time, and those decisions have impacts still on the flooding that's experienced today because they influence how water moves through the area. So I can try to point out and not trip over this. That right there is what is now Pearl Street. It originally wasn't Pearl Street, it was Cove Street because it went along a cove. So that map is from 1854. 1866 and 1868, you start to see the road actually being extended in through that wet area. By 1868, it's called Pearl Street. The one on the left is Cove Street. But the other thing I wanted to point out is the change in the land mass along West Main Street. So whereas it used to be a very narrow split of land, you start to see by the mid to late 1800s that there's a lot of fill material placed and structures built there. This is 1879. By then, Pearl Street is just running straight through what used to be open water, but you can still see that relic of where it went around. And again, even more development south of West Main Street. And by 1912, even more in terms of the West Main Street development. So, it was really interesting in talking to people that live in Pearl Street because whereas on Gravel Street, we talked to people who said, okay, yes, during big events, we have water coming up and over the banks of the river, as you would expect. Well, on Pearl Street, you have a lot of people who get water coming up through their basements. And we learned that now, understanding the legacy of the land, it's because a lot of that area was fill material and water is able to move through it. And you still have this hydrological connection, the drainage patterns, right? Even though we built on where there had been water previously. So it added so much to our understanding of the area. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk about some of the preliminary flood and heat vulnerability assessment results.
Great, thank you, Megan. So I'm Sam Bell. I'm a senior resiliency planner with GZA, and I'm one of the planning leads. And we're very excited today. Thank you so much for attending. I'm going to start off with the hazard characterization, and as Megan said, we focus on two actual hazards. We're looking at flooding, but we're looking at it both from coastal flooding and intense precipitation, and then we're also looking at extreme temperature in the form of heat. And in terms of the coastal flooding, so this next few slides that I'm going to go through, we're going to be looking at the FEMA flood hazard maps, which are more of your regulatory maps that drive a lot of your development and floodplain requirements, but we're also going to be looking at some modeling that CERCA has completed, and we're going to be looking at that because this area, as we all know, floods during high probability events. Like this past December, we saw a lot of flooding, in the areas north and south of Main Street. But so this first map here is actually CERCA's 10-year present day. And just to give a background on probability, it doesn't mean you're going to get a flood, once every 10 years. It's really a 1 in 10 chance that you're going to get a flood any given year. It's kind of like flipping a coin where you have a 50% probability to land on heads or tails. If you flip it 5 times and it's tails, 5 times, the probability of it being a heads the next time is much higher. And so what you can see here is that current day higher probability flooding, the town does experience a lot of flooding, in the parking lot south of West Main Street and along Gravell Street north, and then further down in Water Street. And what I'm going to do is kind of next go through and show you what that looks like in the future, in 2050. And I just want to do a disclaimer here that we didn't just pull that 2050 out of a hat. It's actually in compliance with Connecticut's Public Act number 1882, and what that asks folks and communities to look at is 20 inches of sea level rise looking forward in 2050. And what you can see here, the darker blue areas, you can then start to see more flooding along Pearl Street, and it gets deeper, and then it starts to expand into other areas south in Water Street and then down in the Tufts Bay area. But this is just trying to show you that, that area of inundation is going to get larger during even high probability events not too far away. So the next one I'm going to show you is the FEMA flood insurance map. How many folks are familiar with that map? All right, that's awesome. It looks like we have a quorum there. So this current map, the base flood elevation is for most of the downtown Mystic area is about 11 feet. And throughout, north to south, but in this area here, the base of flood elevation is actually lower. It's 10 feet. So when we're starting to think about the future, what we're doing is we're adding pretty much 1.7 feet to that base flood elevation. So it's going to show that's going to be an increased depth. And what I'm trying to show you here is that the area of inundation doesn't get much bigger. And we just did a course calculation because we didn't do any modeling for this plan. But what the map on the lower left corner shows you the topography. So as many of you know, you have huge rise in elevation in these areas, which kind of led to the depth increasing, but the area of inundations not getting much bigger, except in this area in the south, which kind of makes sense because it's the two biggest factors that are going to drive flooding are going to be the elevation of the water and the elevation of the land. And down in that area, it's much lower lying. And so now kind of looking at the intense precipitation, we are doing some HECRAS stormwater modeling that hasn't been completed yet, but what we'll be showing is kind of rainfall runoff onto your roadways. But this here is just precipitation projections that was from a study in 2019 by Circa. And this bottom number, this is for a 24-hour rainfall for a 100-year storm or a 1% annual chance probability event. And what it's showing, I mean, these numbers are, the main point we're trying to make is the depth of that flooding is going to increase by several inches when you look out to the time frame we're looking at, about the 2040 to 2070 time frame for this data. And then we have projections here for precipitation based on the National Climate Assessment. And the take home here is we have different emission scenarios, which will drive the rainfall amounts and also will drive the heat amounts. And for the higher end emissions, what we're looking at for precipitation is about, I want to say a little over 5 inches increase in annual rainfall. And now in looking at heat, what we're looking at, and we've actually seen an increase over the last, I'd say from 1960 to 2020, I think there's been over a 3-degree Fahrenheit increase in the average daily temperature based on the higher emissions scenario. And we typically try to look in between at the range of those issues, but we're looking at about 4 to 6 inches when you look at, or 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit increase looking out to 2050. So that's why the heat, it is going to be a bigger issue. I just want to make a disclaimer about, we did look at humidity, and Circa drafted a study that looked primarily at temperature, but they did not do a combined evaluation with humidity. And what was noted in that study is that even though no results were found, they did a literature review and found that there will be, due to increased humidity and temperature, it will potentially have increased health impacts on the general public in the future. So the take home from that is an additional study will need to be developed to get more quantitatively based information. And now we're getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of the vulnerability assessment. And so we're going to look at the flood risk, we're going to look at intense precipitation, and then temperature. The flood risk, we'll be looking at the same probability events we looked at before. What this shows you here on the left is the number of buildings and structures that are exposed to that 10-year Circa flood. It's about 41 structures. And then if you look to the right, you can see we've kind of circled in purple the increased area of inundation. That number jumps to 96 in 2050. So that it more than doubles. So that gives you a understand of the increased, these more frequent events are going to start impacting even more properties. And then when we look at the FEMA numbers, there's not a huge increase in the structures for the reasons I talked to about before, because the area of inundation doesn't expand too much due to the topography. But it's a little over 220 properties today that are in that area of inundation. And then actually it's about 212. I got to get my numbers right. And then it's going to actually increase by about 11 when you go into looking at 2050. Also, in this vulnerability assessment, I'm not going to go and look at all of the existing conditions. We're just giving you some examples because we just are giving you kind of a primer. But this is looking at roadways, and what the image on the left shows is that there's about a half a mile of roadways in the area of inundation for that current day Circa 10-year, and on the right, it actually increases to just under about a mile. So the area of roadways actually almost doubles for those events, which is kind of similar to what we saw with the structures. And those roadways are really critical because they provide access, for all of you who are residents and business owners, but also they're really important for essential facilities and first response. When you're talking about operationalizing support during these types of events. And then in the future, roadways, the increase, it's about 1.5 miles of roads that are in the area of inundation, and then that increases to about 1.6. So there's a slight increase, and that's similar to the rationale that we described with the structures, just because that area of inundation doesn't expand too far. And then so for precipitation, we'll have more detailed results when we finish the HECRAS kind of modeling that we're developing. We'll show you stormwater runoffs. You'll be able to see that in the draft plan later this summer or into the fall. But just on the kind of high-level results that I told you about, there's going to be increasing vulnerability to precipitation. We expect the depths during those heavy rainfalls to increase. And then we also expect there to be more precipitation looking out to 2050. And then extreme temperature. So we don't just look at the increase in average temperature, we're also looking at the number of days over 90 degrees. We also look at the number of days below 32 degrees Fahrenheit to give you that idea. The number of days over 90 are actually going to be increasing, as you can see, by about 17, and then the number of days below 32 are going to be decreasing by almost that same amount. So you're almost having 30 days of warmer temperatures that could impact, issues related to public health in the future. And so, as far as questions, we're gonna actually, if you have questions after this, I'm gonna go into the next steps, but I just wanted to let you know that we'll be taking questions kind of in our own station. So any questions you have based on the presentation that Megan and I gave, we'd be happy to answer those, but we'll be kind of doing those on kind of in just a one-on-one basis at the stations we'll be talking with you about. And a lot of this information we talked here, as you've seen, is provided in even more depth at each of the existing conditions, hazard characterization, and vulnerability assessment. So the real next step is to finalize the vulnerability assessment. We're going to be developing adaptation strategies and actions. We'll be identifying actions and strategies that are realistic and best suited for downtown Mystic. And then we'll also be developing kind of a qualitative ranking criteria. And what we do with that is we'll be working in collaboration with the town to find factors that are most useful to the community. And then all of that will be folded into a draft plan that will be available to the public later this year.
Just a couple last comments. We are so appreciative to the day for always helping us get the word out about these events. So Kim Drellick is here, and she's really interested in talking to people who live in this area, who work in this area, who are experiencing flooding. So if you are interested in chatting with Kim, she's available. Please reach out to her. Two other events just wanted to put on people's radar. So the Women's Fellowship of the Mystic Congregational Church on the morning of May 9th is having a presentation. I'll be there. John Trzynski from CERCO will also be there talking about flooding and floodplains. So everyone is welcome. I have the flyer on the side. That is Tuesday, May 9th at 9:15. And then that evening, the Town of Groton's Resiliency and Sustainability Task Force, along with CERCA, is co-hosting a Groton Climate Forum. So there's going to be the showing of a film produced by CT Public all about climate change in Connecticut. And then there's going to be a panel discussion with producers from the film and folks from CERCA who were involved in the film. So it'll be another great event to learn more and get to talk about what's happening here. And with that, thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Some technical issues before you get started. See you again? Storm surge.